I arrived at my lakeside cabin after retirement, expecting peace and a fresh start, only to find my son hosting a luxurious gathering for his wife's wealthy family inside my home. When he looked me in the eyes and said, "Get off my property before I call the police," I didn't argue. I stayed calm, pulled out my phone, and quietly prepared to show them the truth they never expected to face that night. I'm so grateful you're here for this dad family revenge story. What city or country are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Note: this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and valuable life lessons. Any resemblance to actual names or places is purely coincidental, but the underlying message remains deeply useful. The key didn't turn. I stood on the porch of my own cabin, the one I had purchased with a cashier's check, on a Thursday morning in September of 2005, and I twisted the key I had carried on the same ring for 19 years, and the lock did not move, not even a little. The mechanism had been replaced. The slot was different, smaller, recessed, the kind that reads a fingerprint instead of a cut piece of metal. I pulled the key out and looked at it the way a man looks at something that used to make sense and no longer does. Behind me, the gravel driveway held 5 vehicles I had never seen before: a black Range Rover, a silver Cadillac Escalade, a white Mercedes G-Wagon with a temporary tag still on the rear window, a dark green Jeep with luggage visible through the back glass, and a red BMW coupe parked sideways across 2 spaces like whoever drove it had never once worried about inconveniencing another person. None of those vehicles belonged to me. My truck, a 2017 Ford F-250 with 114,000 miles and a crack in the passenger side mirror I kept meaning to fix, sat at the end of the line, looking like it had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. I had been planning this particular drive for 2 years. 35 years with Pacific Western Electric. 35 years of site assessments and load calculations and industrial grid design of conference calls at 6 in the morning and emergency visits to substations in the rain. I had started as a junior engineer when Ronald Reagan was still in office, and I had finished as chief systems engineer with 3 patents bearing my name and a retirement package that my financial advisor called, with considerable understatement, comfortable. My colleagues had given me a party in the break room on my last day. Someone had ordered a sheet cake with a cartoon lightning bolt on it. There had been a card signed by 41 people. I had driven straight from that party to this mountain. Lake Arrowhead sat at 5,200 feet in the San Bernardino Mountains, 90 minutes east of Los Angeles, on a clear day longer when the weekend traffic backed up on State Route 18. The cabin itself was wood-framed, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a stone fireplace I had rebuilt myself the summer after my divorce, and a dock that extended 14 feet over the water where I had spent more peaceful mornings than I could count. I had installed the solar energy system myself in 2016, a grid-tied setup with battery backup that I had designed from scratch and registered under my own name with the California Energy Commission. The system powered the entire property. Heat, cooling, hot water lights, the whole thing. The whole thing that someone had thrown a party in without asking me. Through the front window, I could see the dining table pushed against the wall and folding chairs arranged in rows. A banner hung above the fireplace. My fireplace, the one I had mortared stone by stone with my own hands. And even through the glass, even in the fading August light, I could read it clearly. White letters on navy blue. The kind of banner you order from a print shop when you want people to know you have arrived. It read, "Lake House of Ethan and Lauren. 5 years and forever." I set my duffel bag down on the porch. I pressed my palm flat against the wood railing I had sanded and sealed 3 summers ago. I breathed in the pine air that I had been smelling in my memory every single day for the past 2 years of planning this trip. And I stood there for a long moment, working out what kind of man I intended to be in the next few minutes. Then the front door opened. My son was 31 years old, and he had gotten his mother's height and his grandfather's jaw, and as it turned out, a talent for looking at his father like a problem to be managed. He stepped onto the porch in dark slacks and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, holding a glass of red wine, and his expression when he saw me was not surprise. It was calculation. He had known I might come. He had prepared for it. "Dad." His voice came out measured, not warm. The voice of a man running a meeting. "This isn't a good time." "I drove 4 hours," I said, "and my key doesn't work." "I upgraded the locks." He said it the way you say you upgraded the cable package. Casual, obvious, already moving on. "The old mechanical ones were a security risk. The biometric system is much more reliable." "Ethan." I kept my voice level. "This is my property." Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt, not quite. Something closer to the look a poker player gets when the hand he is holding is not as strong as he has been representing, but he has decided to stay in anyway. He set his wine glass on the railing beside my hand and squared his shoulders. "We have guests inside," he said. "Lauren's entire family drove up from Newport Beach. I would appreciate it if you didn't make a scene." The sun was dropping behind the ridge to the west. The light on Lake Arrowhead had gone from gold to copper, and somewhere across the water, a motorboat was cutting a white line through the surface. It was objectively one of the most beautiful evenings I had seen in years. I had been looking forward to watching that exact sunset from my dock with a cup of coffee and absolutely nothing else required of me. I picked up my duffel bag. "I'm not going to make a scene," I told my son. "I'm going to walk into my house." His hand came up and pressed flat against the doorframe, blocking the entrance. His jaw tightened. And then he said in a voice loud enough to carry through the glass to the people inside the words that I would spend a long time turning over afterward. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. This is private property, and you were not invited. I had built this cabin with my own hands, rebuilt it, repaired it, and paid property taxes on it for 19 consecutive years. And my son had just told me to get off the porch." I looked at his hand on the doorframe. I looked at his face, and I made myself a promise right then, standing in the copper light of the last evening of my working life, that before this weekend was finished, every single person inside that cabin was going to know exactly whose property they were standing on. I pushed past his arm and walked into my own house. The front door opened into the main room, and the main room stopped. Not all at once, it happened in a wave, starting from the people nearest the door and rolling backward through the crowd the way a ripple moves across still water. Conversations dropped. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. 15 faces turned toward me, and every single one of them wore the same expression, the polite, cautious look of people who have just noticed a stranger has walked into a room where strangers do not belong. The banner above my fireplace was bigger up close. Navy blue-white lettering, the kind of thick vinyl print that costs about $60 at any FedEx shop in the country. Someone had used painter's tape to hang it directly over the mounted elk antlers I had brought back from a trip to Wyoming in 2012. There were candles on the mantel, white pillar candles in glass holders that I had never owned. The dining table had been pushed to the far wall and covered with a linen cloth, and on it sat the kind of spread that gets described on Instagram as elevated charcuterie boards. Shrimp, cocktail towers, wine bottles with French labels I couldn't read from the door. The room smelled like expensive cologne and someone else's choices. Ethan moved past me and stepped into the center of the room with the ease of a man who had choreographed this exact entrance. He set his wine glass down on the side table, my side table, the one I had bought at an estate sale in Redlands in 2009, and spread his arms slightly, the way a host does when he wants to signal that everything is under control. "Sorry about that, everyone," he said, his voice carrying the warm, confident register of a man who has practiced being charming. "This is Richard. He used to do electrical work out here. Older gentleman lives down in the valley. He gets a little confused sometimes about which properties he's worked on. We've had to redirect him before." The room relaxed. A woman in a cream blazer near the back actually laughed softly, a sympathetic sound, the kind you make for a story about someone's forgetful uncle. Two men near the fireplace went back to their conversation. A teenager in the corner looked back down at his phone. I stood in the middle of my living room and let the words land. 35 years of designing industrial electrical systems, 3 patents, a retirement package that included stock options, and a commendation letter from the California Public Utilities Commission. And my son had just introduced me to 15 strangers as the confused old handyman. A woman separated herself from the group near the kitchen doorway and walked toward me. She was in her early 60s, dressed in the kind of resort casual that signals money without trying to linen pants gold jewelry hair that had been recently and expensively done. She looked at me from my boots to my jacket with the slow, deliberate attention of someone pricing merchandise at an estate sale and finding it below reserve. "So you're the electrician," she said, not unkindly, almost worse than unkind, dismissive the way weather is dismissive. "I'm Richard Miller," I said. "I own this property." She blinked. Then she smiled the way people smile when they decide to be patient with someone who is confused. "I'm Carol, Lauren's mother. We've heard so much about this place." She glanced around the room with proprietary satisfaction. "Ethan has done such wonderful things with it." Before I could respond, Lauren appeared from the kitchen doorway. My daughter-in-law was 29 years old with her mother's posture, and as I was learning her mother's instinct for social control. She took one look at me, the work jacket, the fishing boots, the bag still over my shoulder, and her expression curdled the way milk curdles when you add something acidic. "What are you doing here?" she said, low and sharp enough that the nearest cluster of guests heard it and pretended not to. "You could have called first. You look like you just came off a construction site. Do you have any idea what you look like standing there right now?" "I look like a man who drove 4 hours to reach his own cabin," I said. A hand landed on my shoulder from behind, firm measured. I turned. The man was about 65, silver-haired, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that has spent decades making decisions and expects to keep making them. He extended his hand. "Douglas Whitfield," he said. "Lauren's father. I apologize for any confusion here. Can we get you something to drink while we sort this out?" It was the most dignified brush-off I had ever received. Douglas was not a cruel man, I could see that immediately. He was a man who had been told a story and believed it, and he was trying to manage a situation that did not yet make sense to him. He had a firm handshake and kind eyes and absolutely no idea that he was standing in someone else's house. Across the room, a broad man in his late 30s. Frank Lauren's brother, I would learn, had stopped pretending to look at the bookshelves and was watching me with open curiosity. His eyes moved from my face to the watch on my wrist. A pocket watch on a chain gold case, the kind they do not make anymore. The company had presented it to me at my 35th year ceremony, engraved on the back with my name and the years of service. Frank had the look of a man who recognized quality when he saw it, and was already calculating what that quality might be worth. Ethan came to stand beside Lauren. He put his arm around her shoulders, and together they looked at me with the unified front of two people who had rehearsed this moment and were confident in the script. "Dad," Ethan said loudly enough for the room. "I think you should head back down the mountain tonight. Lauren's family came a long way, and we really don't have room for unexpected guests." I looked at the banner above my fireplace. I looked at the candles on my mantel. I looked at the 15 people holding wine in my living room, none of whom knew a single true thing about where they were standing. And I thought about the 2 text messages I had not yet sent. The one sitting in my phone like a loaded question waiting for the right moment to become an answer. "All right," I said quietly. "I'll stay out of your way tonight." Ethan's shoulders dropped half an inch with relief. He should not have relaxed. Ethan found me a chair 20 minutes later, not one of the folding chairs arranged in neat rows across my living room floor. Not one of the 6 cedar chairs I had bought at a furniture store in San Bernardino 12 years ago, and refinished myself with teak oil every spring since. He went to the storage room off the back of the kitchen, the one I had built as an addition in 2009, the same summer. I put in the second bathroom, and he came back dragging a plastic lawn chair with a crack, running up the left rear leg that I had set aside 3 summers ago, meaning to throw away and never quite gotten around to it. He set it down in the corner of the kitchen between the trash can and the wall where the broom hung on its hook. "There you go," he said. "Plenty of room back here." The kitchen corner had a partial view through the pass-through into the dining area where the linen-covered table held enough food to provision a small restaurant. Shrimp cocktail, lobster bisque in individual white ramekins, a whole poached salmon decorated with thin cucumber slices arranged in overlapping rows, 3 bottles of Napa Valley Cabernet that I could see from where I was standing, each one priced. I estimated somewhere between $80 and $120. Lauren appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying an empty serving dish and stopped when she saw me sitting in the corner. Her expression cycled through something complicated before settling on irritation. "Ethan said you were staying in the kitchen," she said. "Fine, but stay out of the way. We have a caterer coming through in 20 minutes to refresh the boards." She set the dish on the counter and walked back out without waiting for a response. I heard her laugh at something someone said in the other room, a real laugh, easy and unguarded, the laugh of a woman who was completely at home. In my kitchen, a young woman I did not recognize set a bowl on the counter near the stove and gave me a brief, sympathetic smile before retreating. One of the catering staff I assumed hired for the evening. She had the look of someone who had witnessed uncomfortable family situations before and had learned not to get involved. I sat in the cracked plastic chair and looked at the bowl she had left. It was soup. Clam chowder from the smell of it, the thick, cream-based New England style that I had always preferred to the Manhattan variety. It had gone lukewarm at the edges and had that particular skin forming across the top that soup gets when it has been sitting out too long. There was a plastic spoon set across the rim instead of a proper one from the silverware drawer 3 feet to my left. Through the pass-through, I could hear Ethan talking. His voice had the rhythm of a man performing rises and falls timed for effect, pauses inserted for laughter, the cadence of someone who has practiced telling stories about himself. I caught fragments. Something about a property deal in Scottsdale. Something about a developer he had met at a conference in Las Vegas. Something about projections and square footage and emerging markets. The words of a man describing a life he was wearing rather than living. I knew that life cost him nothing to describe, because I had been paying for the actual version of it for the better part of a decade. The monthly transfers had started small. $300 here, $500 there, the kind of amounts a father sends a son without keeping a ledger, because keeping a ledger feels like distrust. But distrust, I had come to understand, is sometimes just a word for accurate accounting. By last year, I had calculated the total at something close to $260,000 across 10 years. Rent subsidies, car payments, Credit card balances cleared twice. Health insurance premiums. The registration fees for a real estate licensing course Ethan had enrolled in and quietly dropped after 6 weeks. I had never asked for any of it back. I had told myself it was love. I was beginning to understand it had also been avoidance. Frank's voice rose above the others in the dining room, a big, carrying voice, the kind that assumes it is always welcome. He was telling a story that involved a boat and a business associate and a punchline I missed. Carol laughed at it with the enthusiasm of a woman who laughs at her son's stories on principle. Douglas said something measured and quiet that I could not make out. I looked down at the soup. 35 years. I had worked 35 years designing systems that powered hospitals and manufacturing plants and water treatment facilities across the state of California. I had systems running right now tonight in buildings from Bakersfield to Sacramento, keeping lights on and equipment running and people safe. My name was on 3 patents filed with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I had a commendation letter from the governor's office framed on the wall of my study back in Charlotte, and my son had served me leftover soup in a cracked plastic chair in my own kitchen. I picked up the plastic spoon. I set it back down. I pushed the bowl 2 inches to the left and folded my hands on the counter in front of me and looked through the pass-through at the table full of food that had been purchased. I was almost certain, with money withdrawn from the joint savings account I had established for my own end-of-life care. The account I had trusted Ethan to manage. The account I had not checked in 4 months, because checking it had felt at the time like the wrong kind of fathering. I was going to check it tonight. Through the pass-through, I watched Frank refill his wine glass and turned to say something to Ethan. Ethan laughed that same performed laugh I had been hearing all evening and clapped Frank on the shoulder. Frank's eyes slid sideways as he laughed the way eyes do when the mind is somewhere else. And for just a moment, they landed on my wrist through the pass-through opening. On the watch. He looked away quickly, but not before I had seen exactly what was in his expression. I pulled my sleeve down over the watch face and sat back in the plastic chair and listened to the party happening in my house. And I started thinking very carefully about tomorrow morning. I waited until the noise from the dining room reached its peak before I moved. There is a particular volume that a party hits when the wine has been flowing for 2 hours and the food has been cleared, and everyone has stopped being careful about how much they are enjoying themselves. It is the volume at which a man can move through a house without being noticed, which was exactly what I needed. I picked up my duffel bag from the kitchen corner where I had left it, slipped past the catering woman restacking plates near the sink, and walked down the hallway to the master bedroom. The door was closed. I opened it. The room had been rearranged. My furniture was still there. The queen frame I had bought the year I finished the cabin, the matching nightstands, the tall dresser against the far wall. But the surfaces had been cleared of everything that was mine. The small wooden box where I kept spare keys and a backup phone charger. The paperback I had been reading in stages over the past 3 visits left spine up on the nightstand. The framed watercolor of Lake Arrowhead at sunrise that a local artist had sold me at a craft fair in Blue Jay 8 years ago. All of it was gone. In their place, Lauren's things. A monogrammed toiletry bag on the dresser. A pair of heeled sandals lined up precisely beside the closet door. 2 matching suitcases, expensive ones with the kind of quiet hardware that signals they cost more than my first car payment. A charging station on the nightstand holding 2 phones and a wireless speaker that was currently playing very softly the same background music I had been hearing all evening. And on the wall above the headboard, where I had hung a photograph of my father standing on the dock the year he turned 70, there was now a large canvas print. A professional photograph studio lit, the kind you commission from a photographer who specializes in making people look like the family they want other people to think they are. Ethan and Lauren in matching white linen, both of them smiling with the particular confidence of people who have not yet been asked to account for anything. I set my bag on the floor and opened the closet. My clothes, the few things I had brought for the weekend, I hung on the empty rod on the left side. Then I crouched down to slide my bag onto the closet floor, and that was when I saw it. The trash can beside the dresser had been pushed partially under the bed, the way you push something when you want it out of sight, but do not have time to deal with it properly. The corner of a picture frame was sticking out from beneath a folded paper towel. I pulled the trash can out. Inside, it face down, was the photograph I had kept on the wall of this bedroom for 11 years. Ethan, at 9 years old, standing on this dock, holding a largemouth bass he had pulled out of Lake Arrowhead on a Saturday morning in July. His face in that photograph was the most purely happy I had ever seen him, mouth open, eyes wide, both arms straining with the effort of holding up a fish that was nearly a third his size. I was standing beside him with my hand on his shoulder, and I was laughing. My chest tightened until breathing required conscious effort. I lifted the photograph out of the trash can and turned it over. The glass was not broken. I set it on the dresser face up and stood there looking at the boy my son used to be. The bedroom door opened behind me. Ethan came in, still carrying his wine glass, still wearing the easy confidence of a man who had been performing well all evening and knew it. He saw the photograph on the dresser, and his jaw tightened, a brief involuntary movement he covered quickly with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Dad, I thought I asked you to stay in the kitchen." "You did," I said. I needed my bag. He crossed the room, picked up the photograph without looking at it, and dropped it back into the trash can. The sound it made frame on plastic, casual and final, hit somewhere behind my sternum like a struck match. "Those old pictures make Lauren uncomfortable," he said. "She wants the room to feel like ours." Before I could respond, the bedroom door opened wider and Frank filled the frame. He had his wine in one hand and the relaxed posture of a man who goes where he likes because no one has ever told him otherwise. His eyes moved around the room, landed on my wrist, and stayed there. "That is a beautiful watch," he said. He said it the way people say things they have already decided. "Thank you," I said. It was a gift. 35th anniversary, Frank asked, stepping closer. "Company presentation." "That is correct." Frank looked at Ethan. Something passed between them. Quick practiced the silent language of men who have had versions of this conversation before. Ethan reached out and closed his hand around my wrist. "Here," he said, and unclipped the chain from my vest pocket before I had processed what was happening. He held it out to Frank. "Take it. It is just a keepsake." My hand came up and closed around Ethan's forearm. My grip was stronger than he expected. I had been doing physical work for 35 years, and my hands had not forgotten it. He pulled back. I held for 1 second. 2. Then I let go, because I had done the calculation. Losing the watch tonight in a struggle was worth less than what I was planning to do in the morning. Frank clipped the chain to his own vest pocket and turned it over in his palm, satisfied the way a man handles something he has always felt he deserved. I looked at my son. "You should get back to your guests," I said. Ethan straightened his collar and walked out. Frank followed, already admiring the watch face in the hallway light. I stood alone in my bedroom, beside a trash can, holding a photograph of my son at 9 years old, and I felt something settle in my chest that was colder and quieter and more permanent than anger. It was clarity. The party wound down the way parties do when the food is gone, and the wine bottles have been turned upside down over glasses to get the last drops out. By 10:30, most of Lauren's family had retreated to their rooms. The cabin had 3 bedrooms, which meant people were doubling up. And I had heard enough conversation through the walls to understand that Ethan had assigned the rooms with the confidence of a man who owned the place. The master to himself and Lauren. The second room to Carol and Douglas. The third, the one I had added in 2009, the one I had framed and drywalled myself over 6 weekends that summer, to Frank and whatever overnight bag he had carried up from Newport Beach. Nobody had offered me a room. Nobody had mentioned it. I had taken a spare blanket from the hall closet. My hall closet stocked with linens I had bought at a Target in Redlands 4 years ago, and folded it over the wooden bench on the front porch. The night air at Lake Arrowhead in late August runs cool after dark, dropping into the low 50s by midnight, and the pine trees hold the cold the way they hold everything else, quietly, completely, without apology. I sat on the bench with the blanket across my knees and looked out at the black water of the lake and listened to the last of the voices inside settle into silence. I was 64 years old. I had worked since I was 16. I had buried my father, survived a divorce, raised a son alone for the better part of his teenage years, and built a career that most engineers would have been proud to put their name on. I had designed systems that ran without failure for decades. I had learned through long practice that the most reliable structures are the ones that account for every possible load before they are built, not after. I had not accounted for this. The screen door opened behind me at 11:15. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. I could hear the particular rhythm of his footsteps, heavier on the right side, a habit from an old ankle injury he had gotten playing baseball at 17 that had never quite healed straight. I had noticed that walk in delivery rooms and little league fields and school auditoriums and graduation ceremonies. I knew it the way you know a sound that has been part of your life for 3 decades. Ethan came around the side of the bench and leaned against the porch railing. He had a cigar this time instead of the wine, a thick one, the kind that costs $30 at a tobacconist and takes 40 minutes to smoke. He lit it with a long match, shook the match out with a practiced flick, and blew the first stream of smoke in a direction that the breeze immediately redirected toward my face. I breathed through it. I kept my eyes on the lake. "You should have called ahead," he said. His voice had dropped the performance register from earlier in the evening. This was his real voice, flatter, more direct, the voice he used when the audience was small enough that the show wasn't worth running. "Lauren's family thinks you're a contractor I used to hire. I'd like to keep it that way through the weekend." "They're going to find out eventually," I said. "Eventually is fine." He drew on the cigar and exhaled slowly. "Eventually is after they've gone on home and the weekend is a good memory. What I need is for you to be cooperative for approximately 40 more hours and then go back to wherever you came from." I turned and looked at him then. He was backlit by the porch light, and the cigar smoke drifted around his head in the still air, and he looked so much like the boy I had raised that for a moment my throat tightened with something that was not anger and not grief, but some combination of both that does not have a clean name in the English language. "Ethan," I said, "this is my home." About that." He tapped ash off the cigar onto my porch railing. "Lauren and I have been talking about the property. The real estate market in the San Bernardino Mountains has been strong for 3 consecutive years. I've been watching the comps. A place like this, lakefront, updated systems, 3 bedrooms, you're looking at 1.2, maybe 1.4 million in the current market." He paused. "We want to use it as collateral for a business loan. Lauren's uncle knows a private lender in Irvine. Flexible terms, fast close." My hands were resting on my knees. I pressed them flat and kept them there. "The property is not for sale," I said, "and it is not collateral. I'm not talking about selling it." His voice carried the patient tone of a man explaining something to someone who is being deliberately slow. I'm talking about a lien, temporary financing. We'd have the loan paid off in 18 months, 2 years maximum. The cabin stays in the family. The cabin is already in the family, I said. It is in my name. He took a long pull on the cigar and let the smoke out through his nose. Then he straightened up from the railing and looked down at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not cruelty exactly, but the absence of the thing that prevents cruelty. The circuit breaker had tripped. Something had been switched off. Ted, he said, and the word landed like a stone dropped from a height. You're 64 years old. You just retired. You don't have a mortgage, you don't have a business, and you're going to be living on a fixed income and whatever Social Security kicks in. You don't need a lakefront property. You need a plan. He tapped more ash onto my railing. Lauren's mother knows a very nice assisted living community in Rancho Cucamonga. Good reviews. Affordable. They have a fishing pond. The lake was perfectly still below us. Somewhere across the water, a single light was burning on the far shore, a cabin like mine, someone else's quiet, someone else's earned peace. A fishing pond, I said. It's not charity, it's practical. He stubbed the cigar out on my railing, leaving a black mark on the wood I had sealed and refinished the previous April. I'll have the paperwork drawn up next month. Title transfer is straightforward. We can do it through a quitclaim deed. Keep the lawyers out of it. Keep it simple. He went back inside without saying goodnight. I sat on the porch bench in the pine-cooled dark and looked at the burn mark on my railing and listened to the screen door settle back into its frame. Somewhere in the trees above the waterline, an owl called once and went quiet. I picked up my phone. The screen read 11:47 p.m. I opened my banking application, and what I saw on the next screen rearranged everything. The balance was $0.00. I read it 3 times. I read it the way you read a medical result that does not match what you were expecting, slowly, carefully, with the specific hope that you have misread something and the specific understanding that you have not. The account number was correct. The routing number was correct. The account name read Richard A. Miller and Ethan J. Miller, joint ownership, established January 2007. The available balance field showed a single character. 0. I scrolled to the transaction history. The withdrawals had come in 3 installments over 6 days in late March of this year. The first on March 22nd was $110,000 transferred to an external account I did not recognize. The second, on March 25th, was $115,000 to the same external account. The third, on March 28th, the last business day of that week, was $115,000. Same destination. Transaction memo on each one read the same 4 words: personal investment authorized withdrawal, $340,000. Gone in 6 days, 5 months ago. I had not checked this account in 5 months, because checking it had felt like distrust, and I had spent 30 years telling myself that trust was the only currency that mattered between a father and a son. I understood now, sitting on a porch bench in the 49-degree dark at nearly midnight, that I had confused trust with willful blindness, and that the difference between those 2 things is approximately $340,000. I put the phone face down on my knee. The lake was perfectly still. The pine trees above the waterline did not move. Somewhere in the distance, a car was working its way up the grade on State Route 18, headlights sweeping the switchbacks before disappearing into the dark. I watched it go and breathed the pine-cold air and sat with what I had just learned, the way you sit with something that cannot be unsaid. That account had taken me 18 years to build. It had started as a practical decision, a joint account established, so that if something happened to me suddenly, Ethan would have immediate access to funds without waiting for probate court. In California, probate can take anywhere from 9 months to 2 years, depending on the complexity of the estate, and I had not wanted my son to be financially stranded while lawyers sorted through paperwork. Joint ownership meant he could access the money the moment he needed it, no court order required. What I had not fully accounted for was that joint ownership also meant he could access the money whenever he wanted it, for any reason without my knowledge or consent. Under California law, either co-owner of a joint account has full withdrawal rights. The bank had done nothing wrong. The transaction was perfectly legal. Ethan had simply walked into a branch in March, or opened a laptop or picked up a phone and transferred our entire 18-year accumulation to somewhere I could not see. I picked up my phone again. My thumb moved to Ethan's contact. I held it there for 4 seconds. Then I opened my attorney's contact instead. Martin Holloway had been my personal attorney for 11 years. He was the kind of lawyer who answered texts after midnight, because he had once told me without any particular drama that his clients tended to need him most at inconvenient hours, and he had arranged his life accordingly. I typed 9 words, need to move on everything we discussed. Starting tonight. Martin had known this call might come. 3 weeks ago, when I had first seen the camera footage of Ethan changing the locks on my cabin, I had driven to Martin's office in Charlotte and spent 2 hours laying out the full picture. The financial support I had been providing, the joint account, the vehicle titles, the credit card guarantees, the cabin deed. Martin had listened without interrupting, made notes in the yellow legal pad he always used, and then walked me through every option available to me under California and federal law. We had built a plan. Tonight I was beginning to execute it. The second text went to my contact at First Pacific Bank, not the general customer service line, but the direct number of the branch manager in San Bernardino, who had handled my accounts for 9 years. The message was brief. Please process the account modifications we discussed on file, effective immediately. Those modifications included the removal of Ethan as authorized user on all 4 credit accounts I had been guaranteeing. The cancellation of automatic payment authorizations on both vehicle loans, the BMW registered to Ethan, the Mercedes registered to Lauren, both financed under my name with my credit. The suspension of the family cellular plan that covered Ethan's phone number, and a formal notification to the Solar Energy Management System registered under my name with the California Energy Commission, revoking third-party access permissions and reinstating sole administrative control to my account. That last one would matter most in approximately 7 hours. I sent both texts. I put the phone in my jacket pocket. I picked up the blanket from the bench, walked to the far end of the porch, and sat down in the wooden Adirondack chair that faced directly out over the water. It was the chair I had built myself from a kit the summer Ethan turned 12, the summer he had decided he was too old to fish with me anymore, but still young enough to sit beside me in the evenings and watch the bats work the surface of the lake for insects. I thought about that boy for a long time. Then I closed my eyes and slept better than I had in years, because there is a particular peace that comes not from solving a problem, but from deciding clearly and completely what you are going to do about it. The sun came up over the San Bernardino Mountains at 6:14 the following morning. I was already awake. I made coffee in my own kitchen at 6:22 in the morning, while 15 people slept in my house. The coffee maker was still where I had left it, on my last visit, pushed to the left side of the counter near the window that faced the dock, positioned so that whoever was making the morning's first cup could look straight out at the water while they waited. Someone had moved it 6 inches to the right to make room for an espresso machine I had never seen before, a stainless steel commercial-style unit that looked like it belonged in a downtown Los Angeles cafe, and cost at a rough estimate somewhere between $800 and $1,200. I moved the espresso machine back 6 inches and returned my coffee maker to its proper position. Small things matter when everything else is large. I took my cup out to the dock at 6:31 and sat in the folding camp chair I kept in the storage box at the end of the planking. The air was 51 degrees and carried the particular clarity that high-altitude mornings carry, the kind that makes distant things look closer and familiar things look exactly like what they are. The surface of Lake Arrowhead was flat and gray-green in the early light, and a great blue heron was working the shallows 20 yards to my left, with the focused patience of a creature that has never once second-guessed its purpose. I watched the heron and drank my coffee and thought about the camera. It was a small unit, a weatherproof outdoor camera I had mounted under the eave of the back porch roof in the spring of 2022, angled to cover the rear entry and the storage area where I kept the key box. I had installed it after a neighbor 2 properties down reported a break-in, and I had connected it to a motion-activated recording system that sent clips to a cloud storage account I checked perhaps twice a year and mostly forgot about. It was not sophisticated. It was the kind of system a practical man installs and does not think much about until he needs it. 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning in early August, my phone had buzzed with a motion alert I almost dismissed as a deer moving through the yard. I had opened the clip. The timestamp read 8:47 in the morning. In the footage, a white panel van was parked in the gravel behind the cabin, and 2 men I did not recognize were unloading equipment near the back door. Ethan was with them, directing the placement of a small cardboard box that I recognized immediately, the fingerprint lock assembly, the same model I had researched and rejected 2 years ago when I had considered upgrading the cabin's security and decided the mechanical key system I already had was sufficient. I had watched the clip 4 times. Then I had driven to Martin Holloway's office in Charlotte. Martin had a yellow legal pad and the listening posture of a man who has spent 30 years being paid to hear things people did not want to say out loud. I laid out everything in the order it had happened, the increasing financial requests over 10 years, the amounts I had covered, the joint account I had established in good faith, the vehicles I had financed, the credit accounts I had guaranteed. I told him about the camera footage. I told him what I suspected about the account balance, though I had not yet checked it. Martin filled 4 pages of his yellow pad without asking a single unnecessary question. Then he told me what my options were. Under California law, as the sole deed holder of the Lake Arrowhead property, I had clear and uncomplicated rights to my own real estate. No lien could be placed on the property without my signature. No title transfer could be executed without my notarized consent. What Ethan had described on the porch the previous evening, a quitclaim deed, a private lender collateral financing, was legally impossible to execute without my active participation. He could not take the cabin. He had never been able to take the cabin. What he could do and had done was take everything I had voluntarily put within his reach. Martin helped me document the path back. The vehicle loans were in my name. I could request repossession through the lenders with appropriate notice. The credit accounts were guaranteed by my credit. I could remove authorized users and revoke guarantees with a single call to each institution. The cellular plan was mine. Cancellation was a 15-minute process. The solar system was registered to me with the California Energy Commission and controlled through a proprietary application on my phone. I could restrict access from anywhere with a cellular signal. We had spent 2 hours building the sequence. Martin had drafted the necessary letters. I had signed them before I left his office, post-dated for execution upon my instruction. Last night, sitting on the porch bench at 11:47, I had given that instruction. I lifted my coffee cup and found it empty. I did not get up to refill it. The heron had moved farther down the shoreline, working methodically through the shallows, unhurried, absolutely certain of what it was doing and why. I watched it for a while and thought about certainty, how rare it is, and how unmistakable when it arrives. My phone showed 6:58. I opened the solar management application and navigated to the system control panel. The status screen showed all systems nominal full battery charge from the previous day's generation, grid-tied backup, active, all circuits live. I pressed and held the master circuit control for 3 seconds until the confirmation prompt appeared. I confirmed. Then I set my phone face up on the arm of the camp chair, looked out at the flat, gray-green water, and waited for the morning to begin. Inside the cabin behind me, the espresso machine went dark. The air conditioning unit cycled down mid-hum and went quiet. Every light on the property, every outlet, every appliance drawing current from the system I had designed and built and registered under my own name stopped. The silence from inside the house lasted approximately 90 seconds. Then the first voice rose. The first voice belonged to Carol. I heard her through the cabin walls before I heard anyone else, a sharp, ascending sound that started as surprise and climbed quickly into indignation, the vocal equivalent of a woman who has never once been made uncomfortable without immediately identifying someone to blame for it. Then a door opened somewhere inside, and the sound sharpened and multiplied as other voices joined it, and within 2 minutes, the front porch door swung open, and Ethan came out wearing an undershirt and athletic shorts, his hair pushed up on one side from sleep, his face carrying the particular disorientation of a man yanked out of a comfortable bed by a problem he did not expect. He stopped when he saw me sitting at the end of the dock. I raised my coffee cup in a small acknowledgement and took a sip. "What happened to the power?" he called across the yard. "System went offline," I said. I kept my voice conversational, the tone I used in engineering meetings when someone asked about a fault condition, and I already knew the answer. "These things happen." He came down the porch steps and crossed the yard to the dock. His bare feet on the morning grass, wincing slightly at the cold and the dew. He stood at the edge of the planking and looked down at me with the expression of a man assembling a theory he did not yet want to believe. "Fix it," he said. "I cannot do that from here." "Then go inside and fix it. The panel is in the utility room, same place it has always been." I set my coffee cup on the arm of the camp chair and looked up at him. "The panel will not help you. This system does not run off a standard breaker box. It is a grid-tied solar array with battery backup designed and installed by me in 2016, registered with the California Energy Commission under my name and my contractor license. The control interface is a proprietary application." I held up my phone. "This application, on this phone, which I control." Ethan stared at the phone. Something moved behind his eyes the moment a man realizes the geometry of a situation is different from what he thought it was. "You shut it off," he said. "I restored sole administrative access to the account holder," I said. "Which is me." He took a breath that expanded his chest and came out through his nose in a controlled stream. Behind him, the front door opened again, and Carol appeared on the porch in a silk robe, her hair pinned up, holding her phone out in front of her, the way people hold phones when they are searching for a signal that is not there. Ethan." Her voice carried across the yard with the precision of a woman accustomed to being heard. "There is no Wi-Fi. The air conditioning has stopped. The water from the tap is cold. I have a hair appointment in Newport Beach tomorrow morning, and I need to know this will be resolved before we sit down to breakfast." "It will be resolved," Ethan said without turning around. "When?" He turned to me. His jaw was tight enough that I could see the muscle working beneath the skin. "Turn it back on," he said, low and direct. "We will talk about last night. We will work something out. But turn it back on right now." "The outdoor temperature is 53 degrees," I said. The system can be restored by a licensed solar technician with access to the administrative override protocol. I would estimate the service call at somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000, depending on the provider. There are 2 companies in the San Bernardino area certified for this system. I can give you the numbers. Ethan's right hand came up and pressed flat against the side of his own face, a gesture I had seen him make exactly once before when he was 14 years old and had broken a window in the garage and was calculating how much trouble he was in. His palm pressed against his cheekbone and his fingers spread into his hair, and he stood there for a full 4 seconds, working through something that was not going the way he had planned. Douglas appeared beside Carol on the porch. He was fully dressed, which told me he had either not slept or had risen early, and he was carrying his own coffee cup empty. I assumed since the machine inside had no power to run. He looked at me on the dock. He looked at Ethan standing at the edge of the planking. He had the measuring quality of a man who has managed complicated situations for a long time and can read the shape of one from a distance. He came down the steps and crossed the yard without hurrying. "Richard," he said, stopping a few feet from the dock edge. "Good morning. Can you help me understand what is happening here?" "Good morning, Douglas," I said. "The property's energy system is currently offline. It will remain offline until I choose to restore it. I want to be straightforward with you about that." Douglas looked at his empty coffee cup. He looked at Ethan. He looked back at me with an expression that had shifted, not hostile but recalibrated. The expression of a man who has just realized the map he was given does not match the terrain. "How long have you owned this property?" he asked. "Since September of 2005, I said. 20 years in 3 weeks. Douglas nodded slowly. He turned to Ethan. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Son," he said, and the word landed with a weight that had nothing to do with affection. "I think you and I need to have a conversation." Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. From the driveway behind the cabin, the sound of a heavy engine turning onto the gravel road reached us before the vehicles came into view. 2 of them, moving at the deliberate, unhurried pace of trucks that have somewhere specific to be and no particular concern about who is watching them get there. I picked up my coffee cup and waited. They came around the side of the cabin at 9 minutes past 9. 2 flatbed tow trucks, both white, both carrying the logo of a San Bernardino recovery company I had contacted through Martin Holloway's office 11 days ago. They moved at the particular pace of vehicles operated by people who are doing a job they have done many times before and feel no special urgency about slow enough to be deliberate, steady enough to signal that nothing about this visit was accidental or negotiable. I stood up from the camp chair and walked back up the dock to the yard. Ethan heard them before he saw them. He had been standing near the porch steps arguing with Douglas in the low-controlled register of men who are trying to have a serious conversation without letting anyone else hear it. When the first truck came around the corner of the cabin, Ethan turned and his face went through 3 expressions in less than 2 seconds: confusion, recognition, and something I can only describe as the specific terror of a man watching a wall he built to keep something out reveal itself as the thing he was trying to keep in. The trucks pulled up alongside the 5 vehicles in the driveway and stopped. The driver of the first truck climbed down with a clipboard and walked toward us without particular hurry. He was a broad man in his 50s, wearing a company jacket and steel-toed boots, and he had the weathered, unhurried manner of someone who has stood in many driveways while people argued with him and has learned that arguing changes nothing about the paperwork. "Morning," he said, looking at me. "Richard Miller." "That is correct," I said. He handed me the clipboard. "Got a voluntary repossession order here for a 2023 BMW 7 Series and a 2022 Mercedes GLE. Both registered to Richard A. Miller, both financed through Pacific Western Lending. You authorized the recovery request on August 21st. I did, I said. I signed where he indicated and handed the clipboard back. Ethan crossed the distance between us in 4 steps. His hand came out and grabbed the clipboard before the driver could pull it back, and he stood there reading the paperwork with the frantic focus of a man looking for a technicality that was not going to be there. "These vehicles are in my use," he said. "I have been making the payments." "Just, sir," the driver said with the patient tone of a man who has heard many versions of this sentence. "The registered owner has authorized recovery. That is the only authorization that applies to this situation. I will call the lender directly. You are welcome to do that." He took the clipboard back with a firm, practiced motion. "The number is on page 2 of the paperwork. In the meantime, we are going to need the keys to both vehicles, or we will load them without." Ethan's head turned toward me. The color in his face had done something complicated, gone red around the jaw and pale around the eyes, simultaneously, the particular pattern of a man whose body cannot decide between rage and fear and has settled for both at once. "You planned this," he said. "I prepared for several possibilities," I said. "Yes. You had no right. Both vehicles are financed under my name, my credit, and my signature," I said. "I have had the right to request recovery since the day I signed the loan documents. I chose not to exercise it until now." From the upper level of the cabin, the sound of the balcony door sliding open carried clearly in the still morning air. Carol's voice came down from above, sharp and carrying. "Ethan, what is happening down there? Who are those men?" Frank appeared on the balcony beside his mother a moment later. He leaned on the railing with his forearms and looked down at the 2 flatbed trucks with an expression that moved from curiosity to calculation to something quieter and more uncomfortable. His hand went to his vest pocket, the pocket where he had put my father's watch the previous evening, and rested there briefly before he pulled it away. Lauren came through the front door at a run, still in her robe, her hair loose. She stopped at the top of the porch steps when she saw the trucks. Her hands gripped the railing hard enough that her knuckles pushed against the skin. "Ethan," she said. "Ethan, those are our cars." "I am handling it," he said without looking at her. "How are you handling it? What does that paperwork say?" He did not answer her. The second truck driver had already attached the wheel lift to the rear axle of the BMW and was operating the hydraulic control with the methodical efficiency of a man on a schedule. The sound of the mechanism, a low grinding mechanical whine, as the rear wheels lifted off the gravel, carried across the yard with a clarity that made several of the upstairs windows produce faces. I counted 9 people visible at various windows and on the balcony within 90 seconds. Douglas came to stand beside me. He had his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the BMW being lifted onto the flatbed, and he did not say anything for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only I could hear it. "How long has he been living on your money?" he asked. "In various forms," I said, "approximately 10 years. Douglas exhaled through his nose. A long, slow breath, the kind that carries a great deal of weight on the way out. He looked at the second truck beginning its approach toward the Mercedes. "He told me he owned this property," Douglas said. "He told me he had built a real estate portfolio. He used this cabin as a reference point, as evidence." He paused. "Lauren's mother and I gave him $30,000 in March. A business investment," he said. My jaw tightened. I had not known about the $30,000. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it without reservation. The BMW cleared the driveway, first loaded, and strapped rolling back toward the gravel road, at the same unhurried pace the trucks had arrived with. The Mercedes followed 12 minutes later. By the time both trucks had turned back onto the road and disappeared into the tree line. The driveway held 3 vehicles instead of 5, and the yard held 17 people in various states of morning dress, all of them looking at a space where 2 cars used to be. Ethan stood in the center of the driveway with his hands at his sides. Lauren was crying at the top of the porch steps. Not quietly, not in the way people cry when they are trying to control it, but with the full, unguarded sound of someone whose understanding of her own life has just shifted in a direction she did not choose and cannot immediately process. Douglas turned to me one more time. "Is there more?" he asked. "There is more," I said. Ethan proposed the restaurant 20 minutes after the second truck disappeared. I will give him this. He recovered faster than most people would have. He stood in the empty driveway for perhaps 4 minutes, and then something visibly reset in him, the way a compass needle resets after you move a magnet away from it. And he turned to the assembled family with an expression that had been reconstructed into something resembling calm. "The car situation is a misunderstanding that will be resolved this afternoon," he said, projecting to the balcony where Carol and Frank were still standing. "In the meantime, since the power is temporarily unavailable, I would like to take everyone to breakfast. There is a restaurant on the water about 1.5 miles down the road. Excellent food. My treat." Carol descended from the balcony with the speed of a woman who had been waiting for someone to take charge of the morning. Douglas followed at a measured pace. Frank came last, and as he passed me in the yard, his hand went again to the vest pocket where my watch was sitting. A brief, unconscious check, the gesture of a man reassuring himself that something valuable is still where he left it. I fell in at the back of the group, without being invited, and without being told not to. Nobody acknowledged me either way, which was its own kind of answer about how invisible a man can become when the people around him have decided by consensus to look somewhere else. The Lake Arrowhead Village restaurant sat on a deck cantilevered over the water with views down the lake toward the dam and on clear mornings all the way to the ridgeline above Blue Jay. It was the kind of California mountain establishment that manages to be simultaneously rustic and expensive, pine beams, stone floors, a menu that described a $12 orange juice as hand-pressed and seasonal. We arrived at 10:41 and were seated at a long table on the outer deck. 17 people arranged around white tablecloths in the sharp morning light. Ethan took the chair at the head of the table. I took the chair at the far end nearest the railing where I could see the water, and more usefully, the faces of everyone at the table without turning my head. The ordering took 20 minutes. Ethan guided it with the expansive generosity of a man spending money. He is confident he has recommending dishes, waving away concerns about price, telling the server to bring a bottle of the sparkling water for the table and 2 orders of the smoked salmon appetizer to start. Carol ordered the eggs Benedict with crab. Frank ordered a ribeye that was listed under the brunch section with a notation that it was market price. Lauren ordered nothing and sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her, staring at the wood grain. Douglas ordered black coffee and did not look at the menu. The meal arrived in stages. Conversation at this table was brittle, the kind that happens when people are working hard to maintain a surface over something that has already broken underneath. Carol made 3 comments about the view. Frank talked about a boat he was thinking of purchasing. Ethan laughed at everything slightly too quickly and refilled wine glasses that nobody had asked to have refilled. I drank my coffee and watched the lake and waited. The server arrived with the check at 11:53. It was a single padded folder, the kind that gets set discreetly beside the host without announcement. Ethan reached for it before it fully touched the table, a practiced motion, the move of a man who has performed the gesture of paying many times and understands its social value. He opened the folder, glanced at the total, and did not react. He slid his black card into the sleeve without hesitation and handed it back to the server with a nod that communicated both confidence and dismissal. The server returned 90 seconds later. She set the folder back on the table with the particular careful gentleness of someone delivering news they did not choose to be responsible for. "I am sorry," she said, keeping her voice low. "This card was declined. Would you like to try another form of payment?" Ethan's expression did not change. He reached into his jacket and produced a second card, the titanium one, the backup. "Try this one," he said. She returned in 60 seconds. "I am so sorry, this one as well." The table had gone the specific quality of quiet that happens when 15 people simultaneously decide to find something else to look at. Carol examined her water glass. Frank straightened his silverware. Two cousins near the middle of the table discovered a pressing need to look at their phones. Ethan produced a third card, then a fourth. The fourth card came back declined in 45 seconds faster than the others, as if the system had recognized a pattern and was no longer willing to entertain the question. The server stood beside the table with the folder in both hands and the expression of a woman who is very good at her job. And this was not the first time her job had required her to stand in exactly this spot. "Sure," she said. "I am afraid all 4 cards have been declined. The message on each one indicates the account has been suspended by the primary cardholder." Ethan's hands were flat on the table. His jaw was working the way a jaw works when a man is running through options and finding the list shorter than expected. He looked at me for the first time since we had sat down, a direct, unguarded look, stripped of the performance register he had been running since I arrived the previous evening. I looked back at him and said nothing. Douglas reached into his breast pocket, produced a card, and held it out to the server without standing up or making any particular ceremony of it. She took it and walked away. Nobody at the table spoke for the 2 minutes and 17 seconds it took for the transaction to process and the server to return with the receipt. Douglas signed it. He capped his pen. He put the pen back in his pocket. He looked down the length of the table at his son-in-law. "We are going back to the cabin," Douglas said, "and you are going to explain to me clearly and completely what is actually going on." Ethan opened his mouth. "Do not," Douglas said. "Tell me another version of what you told me in March." The walk back to the cabin was 1 mile and 4/10. Nobody spoke the entire way. Before I reveal how this confrontation completely shattered the room, comment "Justice" or type 1 below, so I know you're still watching with me. Also, please keep in mind, the upcoming part contains fictional elements and creative dramatization. If that's not what you're looking for, feel free to pause or leave the video right here. Douglas saw it before anyone else. We had filed back into the cabin in the loose, deflated way of a group that has stopped pretending the morning is going according to plan. Carol went directly to the kitchen and stood in front of the powerless espresso machine with her arms crossed, as though the force of her displeasure might persuade it to operate. Frank dropped into one of the living room chairs and pulled out his phone before remembering there was no Wi-Fi, then set it on his knee and stared at it anyway. Lauren sat on the couch with her knees together and her hands folded in her lap, and she had the particular stillness of a woman who has been crying and has decided for now to stop. Douglas walked to the dining table. The trestle table had been cleared from the previous evening's party, but not entirely. A few wine glasses remained at one end, and in the center, half concealed beneath a folded paper napkin, was the document Ethan had printed and left there 2 days ago. A single-sheet standard white paper, the kind that comes out of any office printer in the country. Douglas lifted the napkin, picked up the sheet, and read it. He read it twice. His face did not change while he read it. Douglas Whitfield was the kind of man whose face does not change when he is processing something significant. I had noticed that quality in the driveway that morning, and I noticed it again now. He simply read, and then he set the paper flat on the table and smoothed it once with his palm, the way you smooth something you want to make sure stays exactly where it is. He turned and held it out toward Lauren. She took it with both hands. I watched her eyes move across the page, left to right, top to bottom, the practiced reading speed of someone who processes documents regularly. Then she stopped. Her eyes went back to the top of the page and moved across it again, slower this time. When she looked up, 2 points of color had appeared high on her cheekbones, bright against the pallor the morning had put into her face. She passed it to Carol without speaking. Carol read it with her chin lifted, and her reading glasses, which she produced from her blazer pocket, with a sharp, practiced motion. When she finished, she took the glasses off and held them loosely in one hand, and looked at Ethan with an expression I recognized from somewhere in my own past. The expression a parent wears when they have finally arrived at the specific disappointment they had been hoping would not come. Frank reached over and took the paper from his mother's hand. He read it standing up, one hand in his pocket, the other holding the sheet, and when he finished, he folded it once along its center crease and held it without returning it to anyone. The document was a single-page service agreement. At the top, in a clean sans serif font, it read Pacific Mountain Property Services. Below that, a date from 3 weeks prior. The party of the first part was listed as Ethan J. Miller, property owner. The party of the second part was listed as Richard A. Miller, electrical contractor, hourly rate $15, scope of work, general electrical maintenance and inspection as directed by property owner. $15 an hour. For the man who had designed the electrical system that the document described him as being hired to inspect. I had found the paper on the kitchen counter the previous evening, shortly after Ethan had introduced me to the room as the confused old handyman. I had read it. I had set it back down. I had not mentioned it to anyone because a document like that does not require commentary. It requires only an audience and sufficient time. Both conditions had now been met. Ethan! Douglas's voice filled the room without effort, the voice of a man who has run enough meetings to know that volume is the amateur's tool and that a certain quality of quiet attention is considerably more effective. Come here, please. Ethan had been standing near the kitchen doorway. He came forward 3 steps and stopped. Is this your document? Douglas asked, pointing to the paper in Frank's hand. Ethan's eyes moved to me. I was sitting in the armchair nearest the fireplace, my fireplace beneath the banner that still hung above the mantel, and I had my hands resting on the arms of the chair, and my expression arranged into something that communicated nothing in particular. It was a formality, Ethan said. For insurance purposes. When you hire someone to do electrical work on a property, you need documentation in case of liability. This man is your father, Douglas said. I know that. You created a document describing your father as a $15 an hour contractor working on property you do not own. Ethan's mouth opened and closed. The quality of silence in the room was different from any silence that had preceded it. It had weight and texture, the kind that presses against the skin. From the hallway that led to the back bedrooms, a door opened. A young woman came into the living room, carrying herself with the deliberate quietness of someone who has been listening for a while and has decided the time for listening is finished. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, and she was Lauren's younger sister. Her name was Diane, and she was the only person in Lauren's family who had looked at me from the moment I arrived the previous evening, without the layered assumptions the others had brought with them. She had looked at me simply the way you look at a person when you are actually trying to see them. She was holding her phone in her right hand. She looked at Lauren first, then at Douglas, and then she looked at Ethan with an expression that was not angry and not triumphant, but simply resolved, the face of someone who has made a decision and is at peace with it. There is something everyone needs to see, she said. I should have said something last night. I did not. That was wrong, and I am not going to keep making that mistake. She crossed the room to the television mounted above the fireplace. My fireplace beneath my banner, and connected her phone to the HDMI cable that was still plugged into the set from the previous evening's background music. The screen came on. A video began to play. The room went absolutely rigid. The video lasted 4 minutes and 19 seconds. I know the exact duration because I watched the timestamp in the lower right corner of the screen, the way I watch gauges on an electrical panel. Not because I need the number, but because precision is a habit that does not switch off. The footage was shot on a smartphone stabilized enough to be clear, angled from what I later understood was a position near the bookshelf in the corner of the living room where Diane had set her phone propped against a ceramic bookend sometime before dinner the previous evening. The first sequence showed Ethan leading me to the kitchen corner and dropping the plastic chair onto the floor with one hand, while gesturing toward the broom wall with the other. The audio was clear enough to carry his exact words. Carol made a sound in the back of her throat. When she heard them, a compressed, involuntary sound, the kind that escapes before a person has decided whether to let it out. The second sequence showed Frank in the master bedroom doorway, his eyes on my wrist, and then Ethan's hand closing around the watch chain and unclipping it in a single, practiced motion. On the screen, my hand came up and closed around Ethan's forearm. The grip lasted 2 seconds before I released it. Lauren pressed her fingers flat against her mouth when she saw that part. Her shoulders came forward, and her whole upper body curved inward, as though she was trying to make herself smaller than the moment required. The third sequence was the one that changed the temperature of the room permanently. It showed Ethan on the porch, the cigar in his hand, leaning against the railing. The audio caught everything: the assisted living facility in Rancho Cucamonga, the fishing pond, the quitclaim deed, the private lender in Irvine. It caught the sound of the cigar being stubbed against the freshly sealed wood of my railing. It caught Ethan's footsteps going back inside without saying goodnight. And it caught, in the sudden quiet after the door closed, the sound of me sitting alone on the porch of my own house in the dark. Douglas stood up when that sequence ended. He did not say anything immediately. He walked to the window that faced the dock and stood there with his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him, his shoulders very straight. He stood that way for a full 30 seconds while the video continued playing, and nobody in the room made a sound that was not involuntary. When the video finished, Diane disconnected her phone from the television. She sat down on the arm of the couch nearest Lauren and put her hand on her sister's back between the shoulder blades and kept it there. I stood up. I went to the bedroom where I had hung my jacket the previous evening, reached into the interior pocket, and came back to the living room carrying the blue folder Martin Holloway had prepared in his Charlotte office 3 weeks prior. I set it on the dining table and opened it. "I want to show you something," I said to the room. "Not to make a case. The video has already done that. I want you to have the complete picture because you came here this weekend believing certain things were true, and you deserve to know what is actually true." I laid the documents out in order. The first was the original property deed for the Lake Arrowhead cabin recorded with San Bernardino County in September of 2005. My name, my signature, the legal description of the parcel. 20 years of property tax receipts, each one stamped, paid, each one addressed to Richard A. Miller at the Charlotte address where I had lived for 31 years. The second set was photographs, time-stamped images going back to 2001, the original structure, the addition I framed in 2009, the fireplace rebuild, the dock extension, Ethan at various ages in various seasons on the property, a 9-year-old with a fish, a 14-year-old on the dock at sunset, a 17-year-old loading a kayak. The documentation of a life built in a place accumulated across 2 decades without any particular awareness that it would one day need to serve as evidence. The third document was a summary Martin had prepared of the financial support I had provided Ethan over 10 years. Housing subsidies, vehicle financing, credit account guarantees, insurance premiums, the real estate licensing course fees. The total at the bottom of the page was $263,000. Douglas turned from the window when I set that page down. He crossed the room, picked it up, and read it the way he had read the service agreement earlier, carefully, completely, without expression. Then he set it down and picked up the property deed and read that. He went through each document in the folder with the methodical attention of a man who has spent a career evaluating what is real and what is represented as real and understanding the difference between those two things. Frank had stopped looking at his phone. He was leaning forward in his chair with his forearms on his knees, and his face had lost the easy confidence it had carried since he arrived. His hand went to his vest pocket for the third time that morning, and this time it stayed there. Lauren had not moved from the couch. Her eyes were fixed on the photographs spread across the table, the 9-year-old with the fish specifically. She stared at that image with the concentrated attention of a woman trying to reconcile two versions of a story that cannot both be true. Ethan stood near the kitchen doorway. He had not moved in 11 minutes. His arms were crossed over his chest, not in defiance, but in the way a person crosses their arms when they are cold, and there is nothing left to say, and the body has to do something with itself while the mind works through what comes next. His face had gone to a place I had not seen on it before. Not anger, not calculation, not performance. Something stripped of all of those. Something that might, given enough time and enough honesty, become the beginning of something real. Douglas set the last document down. He looked at me across the table. "I owe you an apology," he said. "My family was brought here under false pretenses. We were told things that were not true. I am sorry for the way you were treated in your own home." I nodded once. "Do not apologize to me," I said. "Apologize to yourself. You lost $30,000 and a weekend. I lost something that takes longer to name." Douglas picked up the deed one more time. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he set it down carefully, squarely in the center of the table. He turned to face his son-in-law. Douglas spoke first, and he spoke quietly. That was the most frightening thing about it. A man who has genuine authority does not need to raise his voice. And Douglas Whitfield had not raised his voice once since I had arrived. He stood at the head of the dining table with his hands flat on the surface and looked at his son-in-law with the particular stillness of a man who has finished processing and is now simply delivering a conclusion. "You borrowed money from our family," Douglas said. "You used a property you do not own as evidence of your credibility. You described yourself to us as a successful real estate professional. You have been none of those things." He paused. "And you introduced your father to my family as a confused handyman in his own home." Ethan's mouth opened. "I am not finished," Douglas said, and Ethan closed it. "You have cost my family $30,000, and whatever Lauren has lost, which I suspect is considerably more than money. I am going to ask you one question, and I want one honest answer. Is there anything at all that you told us about yourself over the past 2 years that is actually true?" The room pressed in around that question, like water filling a space. Ethan looked at Lauren. Lauren had her eyes fixed on the table. She was gripping the edge of the cushion beside her with both hands, her knuckles white against the fabric, her jaw working the way a jaw works when a person is holding something very large inside a very small space. "Lauren," Ethan said. His voice cracked on the second syllable of her name, a small, involuntary fracture that was the most honest sound he had made since I arrived. I can explain, do not. Her voice came out low and absolute. Do not say that to me right now. Carol crossed the room. She was a woman who had spent 62 years knowing exactly what she thought, and approximately 30 seconds deciding whether to say it. She crossed the distance between herself and her son-in-law in 8 steps and stood directly in front of him. And she looked at him with the full, unfiltered weight of a mother whose daughter has just been publicly humiliated in a stranger's house. Her right hand came up and connected with Ethan's left cheek with a sound that was sharp and final, the kind of sound that stops all other sounds in a room completely. Ethan's head turned with the impact. He did not raise his hands. He did not step back. He absorbed it with the stillness of a man who understands at some level that he has earned it. Carol's voice shook when she spoke, but her words did not. You stood in this man's house and called him a senile electrician. You served him soup in a broken chair in his own kitchen. You threw away a photograph of your own father. Her chest was heaving with the effort of keeping her voice below a shout. My daughter gave you 5 years of her life. We gave you $30,000, and you are nothing. You have built nothing. You are standing in someone else's house with someone else's name on every single thing you pretended to own. Ethan's cheek had gone red. His eyes were wet, not with crying, but with the specific pressure of a man whose body has run out of ways to manage what is happening to it. Lauren stood up. She did not look at Ethan when she stood. She looked at me, and her eyes were dry in the way that eyes are dry when everything available for crying has already been spent in private. I am filing the paperwork Monday morning, she said. I need you to know that I had no part in any of this. I believed what he told me. I know that, I said. I am sorry for what you have lost. She nodded once, a small, dignified motion, and walked to the bedroom to begin packing. Frank stood up from his chair. He reached into his vest pocket and removed the gold pocket watch. He crossed the room and set it on the dining table in front of me without ceremony, without comment, without meeting my eyes. Then he went to help his mother with her bags. Diane squeezed Lauren's hand once as her sister passed the couch, then looked at Ethan with an expression that was not cruel and not satisfied, but simply sad, the sadness of a person who saw something coming from a long distance and could not find a way to stop it. Within 22 minutes, every member of Lauren's family had their bags packed and loaded into the remaining vehicles in the driveway. Carol did not look at Ethan again. Douglas shook my hand at the door with a firm, two-handed grip and held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires. Take care of yourself, Richard, he said. You as well, I said. Diane was last. She stopped beside me at the door and looked up with the direct, unguarded quality I had noticed in her from the beginning. I should have said something last night, she said. I'm sorry I waited. You said it when it mattered, I told her. That counts for more than you know. She walked out. The last car pulled away at 12:47 in the afternoon. The cabin settled into a quiet that felt for the first time since I had arrived like mine. Ethan sat on the living room floor with his back against the couch and his arms across his knees, and the house was empty around him in every direction. I made 2 cups of coffee. It was a deliberate choice. I set both cups on the dining table, pulled out the chair across from where Ethan was sitting on the floor, and sat down. I did not tell him to get up. I did not crouch down to his level. I simply set the second cup where he could reach it, and waited, because there are moments in a man's life when the most honest thing you can offer him is the simple fact of your continued presence. He reached up after a moment and took the cup. He wrapped both hands around it and stared into it the way people stare into things when they are not seeing them. "I have nothing," he said. His voice was flat and stripped of everything that usually occupied it. "No car, no cards, no place to go tonight. Lauren is gone." He exhaled through his nose. "I have a duffel bag and whatever cash is in my wallet, which I think is $40. "That is a starting point," I said. He looked up at me then. His eyes were red at the edges, and his face had the specific exhausted quality of a person who has been performing for so long that when the performance finally stops, the muscles do not immediately know what to do with themselves. "How are you this calm?" he asked. "I am not calm," I said. "I am tired. There is a difference." He looked back into his cup. Outside, the lake was moving in slow, easy swells, pushed by an afternoon wind coming down from the ridge. The pine trees along the waterline bent slightly and straightened, bent and straightened, the patient rhythm of things that have been standing long enough not to be bothered by weather. "I need you to tell me something true," I said. "Not an explanation, not a reason, just something true." He was quiet for a moment. His thumb moved around the rim of the cup. "I was ashamed," he said finally. "Of you. Of where I came from. Lauren's family had money and position, and this whole world that I wanted to belong to, and every time I got close to it, I could feel the gap between what I was and what they assumed I was." His jaw tightened. "So I filled the gap with things that were not real. And then I had to keep filling it bigger and bigger until I could not remember where the gap ended and I began." I let that sit for a moment. "I know," I said. He looked up sharply. "You think I did not see it happening?" I asked. "I watched you decide somewhere around 23 or 24 that who I was embarrassed you. I watched you stop telling people what your father did for a living. I watched you start describing yourself as being in real estate before you had closed a single transaction." I set my cup down. "I kept sending money because I told myself it was love. But some of it was guilt. I thought if I gave you enough, you would not need to be ashamed of where you came from. I was wrong about that. You cannot buy a person out of shame. It has to be walked out from the inside." Ethan's eyes were wet. He pressed the heel of his hand against one of them and held it there. "I threw your picture away," he said. His voice broke on the last word, a clean fracture, nothing theatrical about it. "The one from the dock. I threw it in the trash like it was nothing, and it was everything. It was the only honest thing in this whole house this weekend, and I put it in the trash." "I took it out," I said. "It is on the dresser." He pressed both hands over his face and sat that way for a long moment, his shoulders moving with the effort of breathing through something that had no easy passage. His hands were shaking against his face, a fine involuntary tremor, the kind that comes not from cold, but from the body finally releasing something it has been holding at considerable cost. I watched my son and felt the full, unmanageable weight of loving someone you cannot save and cannot abandon and cannot reach across the distance of their own choices. "What do I do?" he asked from behind his hands. "You get up," I said. "That is the first thing. Everything else comes after that." He lowered his hands. His face was wet. He looked at me across the table, not the managed, calculating look I had been receiving since I arrived, but something underneath all of that. Something I recognized from a dock in 2003 when the 9-year-old boy held up a fish with both arms straining and looked at his father like the world had just confirmed something wonderful about itself. He was still in there. "Dad," he said. "I am sorry." The words were small and insufficient and completely true, and I received them the way you receive the only thing a person has left to give. I know you are, I said. I stood up. I picked up both cups and carried them to the kitchen. Through the window above the sink, I could see the dock extending out over the water, and beyond it, the flat afternoon surface of Lake Arrowhead, running all the way to the far ridge. There is one more thing coming, I said without turning around. I need you to understand that it is not punishment. It is the last honest thing I can do for you. I went to the bedroom and came back with a thin manila envelope. Not the blue folder, Martin had prepared that one for the family. This one I had carried in the interior pocket of my duffel bag for 19 years, the same bag I had packed for every trip to this cabin, and it contained 3 documents that I had never shown to another person in my life. Not my ex-wife, not my attorney, not anyone. I set the envelope on the table in front of Ethan. He looked at it without touching it. "Open it," I said. He lifted the flap and slid the documents out. 3 pages, each one a United States Patent Office grant certificate. The first was filed in 2009 for a modular solar integration system for industrial electrical grids. The second 2013 for a fault detection algorithm in high-voltage distribution networks. The third 2017 for a thermal management protocol in battery storage systems. All 3 bore my name. All 3 had been licensed exclusively to Pacific Energy Systems Incorporated in 2018 for a combined total of $3,100,000 paid in full at closing. Ethan read each page slowly. His hands were not shaking anymore. They had gone very still, the particular stillness of a person absorbing something that is reorganizing the architecture of everything they thought they understood. "Tia, my financial advisor has managed the proceeds conservatively," I said. "Current total, including the cabin and all other assets, is approximately $4.2 million. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. I did not live like that money existed because I wanted to know something. I wanted to know if you would value me without it. Whether the man I was, the work I did, the life I built, was enough for my own son to be proud of." Ethan set the papers down. His face had gone somewhere I had not seen it go before. Past shame, past calculation, past the performed versions of remorse he had offered earlier. He pressed both fists against the table surface, and his shoulders dropped forward, and a sound came out of him that was not quite crying and not quite speaking, but something that lived in the space between those 2 things, raw and unguarded and completely without audience. "Dad," he said when he could. "I did not know." "I know you did not," I said. That was the point, and it was also the answer. I stood up. Outside, a vehicle had turned onto the gravel road. I could hear it from the kitchen window, the steady, unhurried approach of something that had been scheduled. "Now everything I built was going to be yours," I said. "Every patent, every dollar. This cabin is the smallest thing I own." I looked at him across the table. "You made choices this weekend that cannot be undone. But you are 31 years old, and 31 is young enough that the choices ahead of you still matter more than the ones behind you." I walked to the front door and opened it. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's vehicle was pulling into the driveway. 2 officers stepped out of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's vehicle. They were unhurried and professional, in the way that people are unhurried and professional when they are executing a request that has been properly filed and involves no ambiguity. The senior officer, a broad man in his 40s with a clipboard under his arm, walked to the porch steps, while his partner remained near the vehicle. "Mr. Miller," he said, looking at me. "That is correct," I said. He handed me a copy of the trespass notice I had filed through Martin Holloway's office 4 days prior under California Penal Code, Section 602. As the sole recorded owner of the property, I had the legal right to require any person to vacate the premises immediately. The notice named Ethan J. Miller specifically. The officer had already served the paperwork. This visit was the execution. Ethan appeared in the doorway behind me. He had his duffel bag over one shoulder, the same bag he had arrived with, I assumed, since everything else he had brought to the cabin had arrived in the BMW that was now sitting in a recovery lot in San Bernardino. He looked at the officers, then at me, then at the clipboard, with the expression of a man reading the last page of a story he had been writing for years and finding that it ended exactly where it had to. Ethan J. Miller, the officer said, "You are required to vacate this property immediately under California Penal Code, Section 602. Do you understand?" "Yes," Ethan said. His voice was steady. That surprised me, and I respected it. He came down the porch steps. He stopped on the bottom step and looked at me directly, and I looked back at him without turning away. "I meant what I said in there," he told me. "I know," I said. "So did I." He shifted the duffel bag on his shoulder and walked down the gravel path toward the road. This afternoon had turned while we were inside. A marine layer had pushed in from the west, the way it does in the San Bernardino Mountains in late summer, and the light had gone from sharp and gold to flat and gray. The first drops of rain were beginning to come down through the pine canopy, slow and widely spaced, the kind of rain that does not announce itself, but simply arrives and stays. Ethan walked without looking back. I watched him until the tree line took him and there was nothing left to watch. The officers completed their documentation, gave me a copy for my records, and drove back down the gravel road. Their taillights disappeared around the first bend. The rain came down steadily, now tapping against the dock planking and the surface of the lake in the particular rhythm that high-altitude rain has, patient, consistent, indifferent to everything happening beneath it. I stood on the porch of my cabin alone, and the quiet that settled around me was the realest thing I had felt in years. I went inside and stood in the middle of my living room. The banner was still hanging above the fireplace. I took it down with both hands, folded it once, and set it on the dining table without ceremony. Then I went to the bedroom, lifted the photograph from the dresser where I had placed it the previous evening, and carried it back to the living room. The nail was still in the wall. Ethan had hung the canvas portrait over it without removing it, which meant the original hanging point was exactly where it had always been. I set the photograph on the nail and stepped back. A 9-year-old boy on a dock holding a fish with both arms, his face open with the specific joy of someone who has just discovered that the world is capable of delivering more than expected. And beside him, a man who built things for a living, laughing with his whole chest, his hand on his son's shoulder. I had carried a frame in my duffel bag. I had known when I packed it 3 days ago in Charlotte that I might need it. I took the photograph down again, transferred it carefully into the new frame and rehung it on the nail. Then I went to the kitchen and poured the last of the morning's coffee into my cup. Even though it had been sitting since 6:30 and was well past the temperature at which coffee is enjoyable, I drank it anyway, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the dock and the rain-gray surface of the lake. I had spent 35 years designing systems built to carry weight. Load-bearing structures, distribution networks, fault-tolerant grids, systems engineered to perform reliably under conditions they were never intended to handle alone. The foundational principle of all of it was simple. A structure only remains sound when the load it carries is distributed honestly. Put too much weight in the wrong place, and the system does not fail loudly. It leans, it compensates, it learns to depend on the compensation. And when you finally correct the load, the whole thing shakes because it has forgotten how to stand on its own. I had applied that principle to every structure I had ever built. I had not applied it to my son. I picked up my fishing rod from the closet where I had left it. The previous evening, walked out to this dock and sat down in the camp chair at the end of the planking. The rain had softened to a mist that sat on the surface of the lake like breath on cold glass. The mountains across the water had disappeared into the low cloud, and the world had contracted to this dock, this chair, this rod, this water. I cast out into the quiet. The line settled. The water held it. And for the first time in longer than I could honestly account for, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I had driven 4 hours to do in the home I had built and paid for and earned on the first day of the rest of my life. I was at peace. Nobody tells you that love can become a structure that fails the person it was built to hold. I spent 35 years designing systems that carried weight power grids, distribution networks, load-bearing frameworks engineered to perform under conditions that would break lesser things. The mathematics of it were never complicated. Put the support in the right place and what you build will stand. Put it in the wrong place and the structure learns to lean on it, learns to need it, loses the capacity to carry itself. And when you finally move the support to where it belongs, everything shakes, not because the structure is broken, but because it has forgotten what standing on its own actually feels like. I thought I was being a good father. I was comfortable one. There is a difference that took me 30 years and one very long weekend to understand. The difference is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It accumulates the way interest accumulates quietly, steadily, invisible, until the day you look at the account and realize the number is nothing like what you expected. A good father gives a child what he needs to grow. A comfortable father gives a child what will keep the peace today, because peace today is easier than growth tomorrow, and because watching your child struggle is one of the hardest things a human being can do without flinching. I flinched. For 10 years, I flinched. Every transfer I made to Ethan's account was a flinch. Every car payment I covered, every rent subsidy, every credit card balance I cleared without a conversation. Each one was me choosing the version of love that hurt less in the moment. And each one made the next one easier to justify, until justification became habit, and habit became identity. And I had built a man who did not know how to stand because I had never required him to. That is on me. As much as anything that happened in that cabin, that is on me. My son made choices I could not make for him. I made choices that made his easier to make. We were both responsible for what that cabin looked like on that Saturday morning in August, and I think somewhere in the honest part of himself, he had buried under 10 years of performance. Ethan knew that too. I do not know what he will build from here. I know that 31 is young enough that the answer to that question is still entirely his to write. But here is what I also know. I know what it felt like to sit across a dining table from my son in the wreckage of everything he had constructed and watch him reach for a cup of coffee with both hands because his hands needed something to hold. I know what it sounded like when his voice broke on a single syllable, not performing, not calculating, just breaking the way things break when they have been under too much pressure for too long, and the pressure is finally gone. I know that the boy who held up a fish on a dock with both arms straining the boy whose face was the most purely happy I had ever seen it, is still somewhere inside the man who walked down my gravel road in the rain with $40 and a duffel bag. I am holding on to that. Not as permission, not as a reason to restore what I removed or to rebuild the scaffolding he was leaning on. I am holding on to it because a father does not stop being a father when he stops being a bank. He becomes something more honest, something more durable, the kind of presence that does not bend every time the wind shifts and that a son can actually measure himself against. I believe in second chances. I believe in them the way I believe in the engineering principle that a structure properly corrected and honestly loaded can stand longer than one that was never stressed at all. The stress is not the enemy of the structure. The stress is what reveals whether the structure is real. And a structure that survives genuine load that has been tested and has held is worth more than anything that has only ever been protected. God does not build things to stay broken. He builds them to be tested, and the testing is the point, not the failure. I have seen enough broken things in my career to know that failure is almost never the end of the story. It is data. It tells you where the load was wrong, where the design needed correction, where the material was not what you thought it was. You take that information and you build again differently with better knowledge than you had before. That is what I am choosing to believe about my son. Not because the evidence is overwhelming, not because he earned it on that Saturday in the San Bernardino Mountains, but because the alternative writing off a 31-year-old man as a finished product is something I am not willing to do. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What I know for certain is this. I drove 4 hours to reach a place I had built with my own hands, and I sat on a dock in the rain with a fishing rod and a cold cup of coffee. And the world was exactly the right size. No performance, no audience, no version of myself constructed for someone else's comfort. Just the water and the mist and the mountains going gray in the low cloud and a line cast out into quiet that belonged entirely to me. That is enough. That has always been enough. The dock is 14 feet long. I built it myself in the summer of 2008, pressure-treated lumber galvanized hardware, the kind of construction designed to outlast the man who built it. I have sat at the end of that dock in every season. This property has offered me spring mornings when the snowmelt runs cold off the ridge, and the fish are moving summer evenings when the light goes gold and the surface goes still, fall afternoons when the aspens on the far shore turn and the whole lake looks like something painted rather than real. I have sat there in grief and in relief and in the ordinary contentment of a man who has nowhere else he needs to be. That Saturday afternoon I sat there in all of those things at once, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the reason I had worked for 35 years and saved carefully and built something real, not so that I could hand it to someone who had not earned it, but so that I could sit at the end of a dock. I built myself and cast a line into water I owned and feel in the most uncomplicated way possible that my life had been worth the living. If this story found something in you, a relationship you have been carrying too carefully, a truth you have been paying, to avoid a conversation you have been postponing, because peace seemed easier than honesty, I hope you will sit with it the way I sat on that dock. Not with anger. Not with the intention of punishment or performance or making someone understand what they cost you. With clarity. With the quiet that comes after a decision has been made and the making of it is finished. The hardest conversations are the ones we have been rehearsing for years and never quite found the moment to begin. I know that. I lived there for a decade. But I also know that the conversation, when it finally happened, was the most honest thing that had passed between my son and me in longer than either of us could honestly measure. And honesty, even when it is painful, is the only foundation worth building on. Leave me a comment and tell me what you thought. If someone in your life needed to hear this today, share it with them. And if you are new here, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. The line is still in the water. There is more to tell. I am not a man who set out to teach anyone a lesson. I set out to go fishing. But if this story, this quiet, painful chapter of family drama revenge that played out over one weekend on a mountain lake, has left you with something, I hope it is this: do not wait until the structure collapses to correct the load. Do not confuse generosity with avoidance. Do not let the people you love most mistake your patience for permission. I should have had the harder conversation years earlier. I kept choosing comfort over honesty, and I called it love. That was my failure as much as anything else that happened in that cabin. God has a way of surfacing what has been buried long enough. I believe that completely. I saw it on that dock in the rain on the first morning of everything that came after. These family stories' revenge are never really about revenge. They are about reclaiming what was always yours. Your dignity, your clarity. The peace you earned and almost let someone take from you without a fight. Do not be like me. Have the conversation earlier. Set the boundary before the damage is done. If this family drama revenge reflected something in your own life, leave a comment and tell me what it brought up for you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you are new here, subscribe. There is more coming that you will not want to miss. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely to illuminate truths worth sitting with. If that is not what you came for, no hard feelings. Find what speaks to your heart. But if you are staying, I am genuinely glad you are here. These family stories revenge and this family drama revenge are far from over.